Thank you, Leslie. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's Healthcare IT News webinar, 5 Ways to Protect Your Organization from a Ransomware Attack. It is sponsored by ClearDATA. I'm Gus Venditto. I'm the Vice President for Content Development at HIMSS Media, and I will act as today's moderator. Ransomware attacks are on the rise throughout the business world, and healthcare organizations are not immune. HIT leaders need to be prepared for the possibility of an attack. During this webinar, you'll gain insight into the 5 most important precautions that healthcare providers should take and the steps that should be followed in the event your system is compromised to minimize the impact on patient care and to restore your systems as quickly as possible. Our speaker for today's event is Chris Bowen. Chris is the Chief Privacy and Security Officer at ClearDATA. Chris, please begin the presentation.
Thanks, Gus. I appreciate it. Appreciate all your time today. We're going to talk, as Gus mentioned, about a few things related to ransomware. It's become a more important topic than even just a few months ago as we start to see healthcare attacks being perpetuated by attackers around encrypting your data, holding it for ransom, and extracting payment from you for that. So again, we're going to talk about some anatomy and psychology of who's doing this and why they want to do this. We're going to go into some of the case studies as to real stories that have happened in healthcare, and we're going to talk about recovery strategies and as well as prevention strategies. But first, let's start out with taking a look at a couple of statistics. If you see one of those screens on the left side of that slide, you are in for a pretty bad day. You're faced with few options. Companies are increasingly giving in to cybercriminals who are holding their data hostage, demanding payment for the return of that data, and even at the same time, law enforcement officials are struggling to catch the nearly invisible perpetrators of these crimes. And the risks have become so severe that many simply just pay the attackers to make them go away. This strategy may actually embolden the crooks. And so barring an up-to-date backup plan or otherwise being able to recover quickly, little can be done except paying the ransom to get your data back. So what does this cost? Well, ransomware attacks are very costly. The average cost of a ransomware payment is around $300. That doesn't sound like much, but if you think about the combined losses up until mid-2015, which was when the FBI put out a report on these losses, there was about $18 million in losses. Estimated Bitcoin transactions from CryptoLocker in a 2-month period alone were about 27 million. And then the Cyber Threat Alliance put out a report that estimated a total loss of about $325 million as a result of ransomware. Now that doesn't really account for all of the downtime, all of the brand reputation hit that your company could go through, as well as the cost that it takes you and your staff to recover. So very, very interesting set of statistics. So the types of cyber attackers are, if you look at the profile of cybercrime, they kind of fit into these buckets, these 5 buckets. So you've got the recreational cyber criminal, you've got the criminal that may just decide to go do some vandalism. Sometimes you'll see hacktivists come into play where they are more emotionally committed to creating some havoc in the cyber world. Organized crime, they really are in this for economic gain. They want to apply some technology resources and capabilities to making their attacks work and pay off. And so what we're seeing is an increase in activity from organized crime around, specifically around ransomware. In fact, CryptoLocker had a team of folks doing nothing but innovating the feature set within CryptoLocker. Very organized, very talented group of folks doing nefarious things. And then, of course, if you look at the state-sponsored attacks, these are where there's really a nearly unlimited amount of resources applied to making lots of havoc happen in the world of the internet and data. So let's talk a little bit about the psychology of the attacker. Why are they doing this? Well, it's easy to buy and use the tools. There's a market out there where you can actually go buy the tools, download them, put them into play. The profit is fairly predictable. So if you're looking at an ROI on these kinds of crimes, they're pretty predictable. There's less risk in the payoff. So the thief of the data no longer has to go find a buyer of the data. They've now locked up your own data, and now you become your market. And so they don't have to do that direct contact. They can stay more invisible to law enforcement and others. Plus, from an automation perspective, they can automate a Bitcoin harvesting operation aligned with ransomware can be put out at massive scale. And so thinking through the psychology of the attacker, now you have to apply some pricing dynamics, and usually the cost of putting out ransomware is comparatively low compared to the risk of non-payment. The individual payment actually could be from $300 to around $30,000, and it just depends. So we wanted to take a look at some of the tools that are being used out there. On your left side, you see some of the tools that are in play. A couple of notable tools, CryptoWall. This one uses really an unbreakable advanced encryption standard model. It's widely distributed. It uses exploit kits and spam campaigns and malvertising. And it uses I2P network proxies and the Tor network for payments using Bitcoin. So it really tries to keep itself in stealth mode for tracking purposes and complete anonymity. CryptoWall is very interesting in the way it encrypts. It's almost a double encryption. And so a brute force against a CryptoWall is almost pointless. Torrent Locker, the makers of this one really try to play on the CryptoLocker brand awareness, if you will. CryptoLocker, as you know, was taken out in an operation, but Torrent Locker has followed in its footsteps. And this tool actually uses file encrypting ransomware. It's distributed by spam email. It also uses AES to encrypt a ton of file types. This one's a little different than CryptoWall because this one will actually harvest email addresses from the victim's computer to then further spread itself around. So it'll send emails to everybody in your contact list in hopes of gaining some traction. Kind of a nasty one. Lucky is a new one. This one came out just a few months ago, but it's aggressively distributed by spam and compromised websites. And this one is interesting because it has a capability of scrambling any file in any directory or mounted drive that it can access. This one is really nasty. So let's talk about how the tools that are being used have started to gain sophistication. We note that in the past, ransomware has really kind of stayed local. It's stayed on your computer. It has stayed to where it can do damage to an individual computer. Advances in ransomware are coming out so that the encryption is now able to traverse network drives, storage area networks, NASs, UNC-paths, anything it can touch and access with the level of permissions granted to the user account, it will be able to encrypt. Now, think about that. Think about if you have a Dropbox account or a Box account or something that you have mapped a drive or a volume to your computer, or even if you're sharing a mounted drive with your colleagues or your peers. And it's really easy to start to understand how an entire organization can be brought to its knees based on some of this technology. So I mentioned a few slides ago that it's really easy to acquire ransomware kits. It's also easy to become infected. There is a website here that allows you to track ransomware. Where is it? It's an interesting URL if you go to it, ransomwaretracker.abuse.ch. It allows you to track it. It allows you to understand a little bit more about ransomware. I've blocked out some of those domain names because I certainly don't want anybody watching to go take a look at one of those sites and become a victim of a drive-by download. But it's an interesting tool nonetheless. So let's talk about the attack itself. What happens? So typically it comes as an email attachment. Maybe it's an invoice. It's a shipping tracking document. It's somewhat generic, but it could really include a vendor name. It could include your own company name. The user machine is typically connected to a network or a shared cloud service. Once the user receives the email and they open the ransomware, they open the document or the zip file, the ransomware will silently begin to encrypt all the files it can without any kind of user interaction or notification. Once it's done, it will then alert the user that it now needs to provide some payment instructions. And of course, payment is usually in Bitcoins. It's interesting that some of the ransomware providers will even provide some customer service information to prove that they can actually decrypt the data that they have encrypted. So then you are faced with a choice. You can either pay up or you can restore. And these are critical choices that you have to make. If you have a good backup, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, then you have a few more options. But if you do pay, you do need to note that you may increase the risk of a future attack. Because again, if I go back to the psychology of the criminal, I want to go where I'm going to get the payoff. I already know you're going to pay, so I'm going to go attack you again, is really how we think about the psychology. I mentioned the email comes in a typical form. You'll see this one as a sample from the IRS. Clicking a link would then take you to a fraudulent website where potentially you could enter your own information, or you could have a drive-by download. That's where some JavaScript or other kinds of programming languages would deploy some nefarious software onto your browser. Here's another example. This one has an attachment. It's a Word document. And so Word documents can be coded with malicious macro-related code. Once you enable the macros in a downloaded document or Excel file or PowerPoint, you can then extract that malicious code, and it will then start to run in the background, and you would never know it. So that's why it's very, very important to never click and open an attachment from somebody who you are absolutely not sure that, or are absolutely sure that they are who they say they are. Always a good idea to scan attachments before you open them as well. So how does it spread? We've alluded to some of the ways: email campaigns, spam campaigns. A lot of times it's targeted particularly at folks in the UK and the US. May come by email, may come by way of a backdoor downloader. If you are installing a piece of software from an untrusted source, maybe that ransomware is part of that installation package that you don't know about. It can also spread by open remote desktop ports that have been open to the internet. And as I mentioned before, it can also spread to mapped drives like thumb drives, Dropbox, Box, any kind of storage share. So let's talk about a couple of case studies here. These are interesting because these are relatively recent. This one, Titus Regional, in January of 2016. They had ransomware encrypt files on several of their database servers. They blocked TRMC's ability to retrieve patient data in the electronic health record system. There was no ransom paid in this case. They had a security team remedy the situation. Now, there's not a lot more detail than that on the resolution of this, but suffice it to say that brute force attacking that encryption key probably didn't work. My gut tells me that they probably restored from a backup that was a pristine backup. Here's another one that you've read so much about, probably. Hollywood Presbyterian in Los Angeles. These guys were down for a little while. It was a pretty bad scenario. They had to go to paper-based charts, paper-based procedures for a week or so. And this attack, again, prevented access to the EMR. It prevented access to all the communications. And the suspected source of the ransomware was really a phishing attack. Somebody sent a link in an email that was clicked by an employee with access or credentials to an EMR system. They paid $17,000, and they did this before contacting law enforcement. And we're going to talk about this in a few minutes, is when is it a good idea to contact law enforcement, and certainly your own legal folks if you're ever hit with ransomware. Now, SamSam, as was responsible in the MedStar health attack. By the way, MedStar never fully admitted that they had ransomware, but employees actually reported screenshots of ransomware demands from all over the place. So this one blocked access to files in all 10 hospitals and 250 outpatient centers. That's just a devastating blow. They demanded, the attackers are reported to have demanded 45 bitcoins within 10 days. And within one day, they claimed that their systems were again, readable but not writable. So pretty interesting. So this one involved SamSam, which is a little different than CryptoLocker, a little different than some of the others that we have talked about. SamSam, unlike the other ones, is really not delivered through a drive-by download or an email. This one is instead the attackers use tools like JexBoss to identify unpatched servers that may be running Red Hat's JBoss enterprise product. So it's a definite attack. Once they have successfully gained entry into one of those servers by exploiting a vulnerability in JBoss, they were able to use other tools to start to collect credentials and then deploy their ransomware. So interesting take on how they're doing that. Methodist Hospital in Kentucky, pardon me. This was just in March. They had Lockheed ransomware take down enough of their data that it was forced to declare an internal state of emergency. The officials now are saying that they have resolved the situation without giving in to the attacker demands. The attack lasted for 5 days. They claim that they did not pay the ransom. We also see reports that this attack came by spam email. So let's talk for a few minutes about recovery strategies. What happens when you're locked down? First of all, hopefully you never have to think about that because you've done the right things. You've enacted your defenses in depth, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But once your files are locked, you either pay up or you restore. And again, I've mentioned that if you pay up, you become potentially a target. Now, going back to the psychology of the criminal, they want you to pay up. They want to incent you to pay up, and that's why you're starting to see more and more producers of ransomware try to help you restore data and ensure that you'll get your data back. Otherwise, you're not incented to pay up. So they want you to believe that it's cheaper, it's faster, it's easier to pay them than it is to restore yourself. Now, If you are a victim, you have a choice to make, but certainly that is a pretty important choice. So again, what happens after you're attacked? Well, first of all, you want to engage your incident response team. You want to make sure you notify your information security team quickly. If you do the wise thing, you'll also engage your legal team to help you with the correct decisions. Your legal team will also help you understand when you should notify law enforcement, how you should notify law enforcement, and your information security team can help you identify how to preserve your evidence for that investigation, and they can help to identify recovery time and recovery point objectives to help your operations team restore your data. So that's the first thing I would do if I were attacked. The second thing would be to isolate the device. As I mentioned a few slides ago, some of the newer ransomware can spread itself very, very quickly. And so removing the impacted system from the network can potentially isolate the threat. Removal of the ransomware is usually best done with the system off the network, and that would likely prevent any spread of the threat, although many times you have to actually rebuild. At some point, you want to try to recover your data. Restore your impacted files from a known good backup that assumes that you are backing your stuff up. You want to restore your files in a way that's the fastest way for you to gain access to your data. So this requires confidence in the integrity of your backups. It requires a destination at which to restore your backups. If you don't have idle servers sitting around that have been off the network and are not subject to the ransomware attack, then you'll have to build those environments and then restore your data appropriately. It could take some time. The hybrid recovery is a different model. This is really where you are trying to stall. You're trying to negotiate the ransom, if you will. In the meantime, you're working on recovery from a known good backup. Again, this requires confidence in the backup, and this is one that you should certainly not try without that confidence and also the guidance of your legal team and potentially law enforcement. Or you could pay the ransom. Now, again, we've talked about reasons why not to pay. There's a couple of reasons why you might consider a payment. One reason is that without a backup, that may be the only realistic means of retrieving your data. And it's possibly quicker and cheaper than restoring or starting over. So just some interesting decisions that have to be made because, at least in Hollywood Presbyterian's scenario, they decided that it would be cheaper for them to pay the $17,000 than to try to recover their systems. So just some very interesting choices that you have to make. And of course, this is the worst choice of all, and that is starting over completely. In this case, getting rid of all of your infected machines, rebuilding from scratch, all of your data would be lost, and you have to actually build from scratch. So that is that's a really terrible option. So let's talk about how to prevent this. It would be great to be prepared to never have to deal with this. So let's talk about some blocking and tackling that needs to be done. You've probably, if you've attended a webinar that I've delivered in the past, you've probably heard me talk a lot about defense in depth. Preventing ransomware really falls in line with a defense in depth strategy and also a defense in breadth strategy, where we're talking about applying controls and security at the physical, the network, system, data, application, and also at the user and process levels. And then certainly you want to reduce your attack surfaces, make sure you have your own encryption and decryption keys, and really help your people understand that they're such an important part of the defense mechanism here. So the first way, in my opinion, to prevent becoming a victim of ransomware is to have a good data backup plan. That means keeping regular and consistent backups along with tested and verified restores. A lot of folks will do a backup of their data, but they will forget to do a test of a restore. Sometimes they cite the fact that, hey, we've got a complex system, I really can't thoroughly test that, and then when they have to test it in a real scenario, they discover that the backups may have been corrupted. So this is very important. Equally as important, however, is making sure that your backup copy is not connected to the same place that your primary servers are and that the rest of your data is at. Again, storing your backup separately is key because some ransomware variants can delete shadow copies of files and other tactics. So you really need to store your backup in a place that's not going to be connected at all. So number 2, if we go looking at the multi-level security layer as well as your data and application security layers, email filtering and phishing awareness. So let's combine these two and let's say, hey, workforce, don't click on links without scrutinizing the email to make sure it's legitimate. Let's make sure that we have trained our people, make sure that they understand the risks that are involved in clicking these links. Inbound emails, by the way, should be scanned for known threats. They should block any attachment type that could pose a threat. So we've seen lots of different types of attachments that are used to distribute malware. Some of your common ones are the zip file, the RAR file, the exe, JavaScript, and certainly blocking macro-enabled content, as I've mentioned before, is a really good idea. Word, Excel, PowerPoint, I list work there, but maybe we block work too. PowerPoint and Word and Excel, by the way, with these macros are a very prolific attack vector. A lot of ransomware has been distributed using those tools. Number 3, antivirus. So exploit kits hosted on compromised websites are used a lot of times to spread malware. You've heard me talk about drive-by downloads. If your software is not up to date, then you're vulnerable potentially. So making sure that you patch your software, make sure it's up to date, make sure that your antivirus is up to date as well and the signatures are defined. Now it's important to also note that ransomware will oftentimes change its signature on a regular basis to try to avoid detection by antivirus. So just be aware again that the reason we're so focused on making sure that our workforce is aware of this is because they can always bypass a security control such as antivirus by just doing a simple click. Number 4, I kind of stole my thunder there. Again, make sure that your systems and your applications are current. Not just your antivirus or your endpoint protection, but make sure your servers are up to date. Make sure you're not running old versions of Fedora, for example, on Linux. Make sure that you have gotten rid of those old operating systems that are no longer supported. There's a reason that HIPAA has laid out the fact that, hey, if you are still using Windows XP or Server 2003 or some of those other older non-supportable operating systems, you're putting yourself at risk, and this is one of the exact reasons as to why the HIPAA security rules help us think about this. Number 5, settings and access control. So we know that ransomware will typically run in your application data folder or your local app data folder, and sometimes in your temp folder. If you are hardening your systems, perhaps you should prevent any kinds of files from running in those common areas that ransomware would run from. Also, show hidden file extensions. If you're a victim of ransomware, you may note that the extension of your file suddenly becomes infected with a .locky or .crypto or some kind of extension that identifies the file as now belonging to the ransomware software. Also, disable your RDP, your remote desktop protocol. If you don't need access remotely to a device, turn it off. It's no different than if you're walking around with your mobile device with your Bluetooth always on or your Wi-Fi always on. There's ways you can close down your attack vectors. Limit your user access to mapped drives. Very, very important here. If you are mapping drives all over the place to store PHI and you're putting all kinds of PDFs for health and history or just Word documents or Excel reports out in a shared drive, you want to limit access to that. That's just good practice anyway. And then certainly install your firewalls and block the Tor networks and the I2P protocols and restrict access to specific ports. It's a little bit techy, but if you have an information security or an IT operations team, they can help you do that. So I covered a bunch of things here today. I've finished a little ahead of schedule, but I wanted to also show you a couple of resources that we use to try to keep ahead of the curve on some of this. I already mentioned the ransomware tracker website. That's a great place to go to understand kind of what's out there, how it's being distributed, and what sites are infected with it. Shodan HQ is a place where you can go to find out if you have a server that might be open and not secured. So if you go there, you can take a look at infected systems. Please don't do anything bad to those systems, but just be aware that you can track your own progress out there if all else fails. It's always interesting when I do a consulting engagement with a customer, and I'll sit in that conference room and we'll start talking about defense in depth. And as we're discussing it, I'll pull up the Shodan website and I'll do a search just to see if I can find any of their servers. It's very rare that I do, but when I do, it's a priceless reaction, and usually stalls the meeting a few hours until they decide, okay, how did this server get listed on this website that shows all the vulnerable servers in the world? There's also prevention kits out there that you can use. SpiceWorks has a bunch of tools that you can go find and use to help you prevent as well. So we're 35 minutes after the hour. I'd love to open it up to questions. So back to you, guys.
Yes. Very good. Thanks, Chris. So our first question is, what is the best way that I can get this problem the visibility it needs within our organization? This is not our highest priority now, and what can I do to change that?
So I love to do simulations, whether that's for disaster recovery or whether that's for a hacking attempt. There's nothing better to show how weak you are than to invite the stakeholders that are responsible to a tabletop simulation. And that's writing a script, rehearsing it with some simulation participants, and then bringing some folks in who would normally operate. Maybe this is your IT security folks, maybe this is a couple of your business folks who perhaps you've got your accounting department that receives lots of invoices by email. Bringing awareness through a simulation is a priceless activity. Practicing that after the fact, practicing those types of reactions based on ransomware is a good way for you to expose the weaknesses that you might have within your organization.
Mm-hmm. We have several, and I should point out that the audience can ask questions by clicking on the little question icon on the screen. The next question we have is, I have heard that application whitelisting is the best way to prevent ransomware. Do you agree? Could you comment on this?
Yeah, so application whitelisting is a great way to lock everything down. There are pluses and minuses to a whitelisting strategy. The plus side is that nothing can run unless it's explicitly approved. That's great. Now, if you have a a really large workforce or if you have a lot of applications that are used, keep in mind you cannot download or run anything that's not explicitly approved. So if you're updating a browser version, you're going to have to approve that. If you're needing to download a module to develop some code, you'll have to explicitly approve that. So the downside of that is that it becomes very manually labor-intensive, where you have to have a really robust approval process or review process, and it just becomes a lot of work for your team. So definitely weigh the pros and cons there.
Very good. Next question, can file monitoring help me to detect and avoid ransomware?
Yeah, so the file monitor, I only had 5 slots that I could put some recommendations here in this webinar. So, but file monitoring can certainly help. If you set up a file monitoring solution to detect, for example, a large number of files being changed in sequence, that could help you understand that you might be having some kind of a backdoor activity happening that you might want to pay attention to quickly. Especially if those files haven't been touched in a while, that you'll want to make sure that you have appropriate file and folder permissions set. And probably the most important thing here would be to make sure that you have visibility to alerts that are going off if you are being attacked and your file monitors are screaming loudly. A lot of times people put these great solutions in place and then they forget to see the visibility of the massive influx of alerts they get on a daily basis, and so sometimes they go undetected. But yeah, it's a great solution.
Yeah, so it's not going to come out and just tap you on the shoulder then, huh?
That'd be nice, but we know that the ransomware folks will do that, but hopefully our monitors can do the same thing. We just have to mind the store.
Pay attention, yeah. Next question is, are ransomware attacks occurring on Linux and Unix systems?
So ransomware attacks attack data. Now, if you have permissions for a set of data that are stored in a Linux environment, you can bet that ransomware is going to attack that. In fact, the SamSam ransomware does just that on a Linux environment. It'll go out and it'll exploit some of the tools that are used within Red Hat.
Mm-hmm. Next question is, could you or would you give guidance on the use of cybersecurity insurance for providers and payers?
So that is a great topic, and that could be its own webinar. Cybersecurity insurance is a more increasingly important tool to have. It does not take away all of your risk. One thing you'll want to be aware of is that the insurance industry is starting to become more and more, I guess, attuned to how healthcare works in terms of data storage and how it's processed. But they never want to be the deepest pockets in a deal. They will also, they'll want to make sure, for example, that you have your own controls in place, your own defense in depth controls that are adequate and operational. If you can get some kind of third-party certification like a high trust or some other kind of control framework in your operation, that can help defray the cost of that. But yes, cybersecurity insurance is absolutely important to combating some of the losses that could be incurred. I would also encourage the whoever asked the question to look at breach response as well as regulatory insurance policies. They do create those policies that allow you to cover yourself in those specific areas.
Mm-hmm. We have time for just a couple more, and so if you do have a question, be sure to ask it now, because we're getting to the end. This question here is asking for whether, in terms of training employees on cybersecurity, which includes awareness of phishing attacks, etc., could you provide guidance on how to create a program? Are there vendors or books or classes that you could recommend?
Yeah, so there's a lot of ways to promote some awareness to your workforce. Number one, you need to have a security awareness training program in place, and The ClearDATA, we do it every quarter. We also do simulations, so we will. I get the job of trying to fish my own organization from time to time to see who's going to click on the link, and then those kinds of simulations become training exercises in themselves. So don't be afraid to reach out to your partner who's providing you with vulnerability management services and say, hey guys and gals, I need you to run a simulation on a phishing attack so that we can show the vulnerability that we have and put training in place. There's also some tools out there. I think one is called ThreatSim that simulates a phishing attack, and when you click on the link, it'll actually send you to a mandated training and awareness computer-based program that you are required to complete before you continue working. So there's some creative solutions out there. I would recommend that you spend the money to get those in place.
Mm-hmm. Well, the remaining questions are just about how to get a copy of this presentation. We've had several people complimenting Chris on the presentation, the timeliness and the thoroughness. And yes, a replay is available. You will be receiving, all attendees will receive an email in the next few days with a replay, and you can watch it, and we encourage you to share it with anyone in your organization who you think can benefit from this. So at this point, I'd like to thank everybody, thank Chris Bowen of ClearDATA for the presentation, and thank the audience for joining us today. When you leave, you will be seeing an exit survey appearing on your screen. We do encourage you to complete it. We use those surveys to improve the quality of our webinars, and we look forward to hearing from you and seeing you again at another webinar soon. So thanks, Chris, and have a wonderful day.